I still vividly remember that fateful day. I was only 12 years old, standing on the porch of our house, my eyes bewildered as I heard the news that my mother, the woman who held me in her arms every night, had vanished after a night shift. 2 years later, my father remarried, embracing his new wife tightly while coldly handing me over to my grandfather, a broken-down alcoholic who treated me like a punching bag for his frustrations. For the next 3 years, my childhood drowned in the acrid stench of liquor and bone-jarring punches. But in that hell, I discovered a strange ability. I could identify the flavor of any type of alcohol with just a sip. Little did I know that the very thing that had once destroyed me would become the wings that carried me away from my past. This is not just a story about a betrayed childhood. It's also about how I turned pain into a weapon. And one day, when my father came back kneeling and begging for my help, I placed before him the only thing he had ever forced me to swallow. Hello, my name is Travis Scott. That name might now make people nod in approval at fancy bars or appear in newspaper headlines, but to me, it was once just the name of a 12-year-old boy, curled up in a corner of a room in Fargo, North Dakota, clutching my mother's shawl. That morning, when a stranger knocked on the door to deliver the news of my mother's accident, I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I couldn't believe she was gone forever. My mother, Deborah Scott, a woman as gentle as the early morning sunlight who hugged me every night and sang lullabies in her hoarse, weary voice after work, was now just a name on a hospital document. They said she had died in a workplace accident. An old weaving machine had caught her during the night shift. Just like that, she was gone, like a cold gust of wind passing through, leaving me abandoned in the middle of life. Before that fateful day, my life wasn't exactly paradise, but at least I had my mother. Our family lived in a small house with faded wooden walls on the edge of town. The house wasn't luxurious. There was an old dining table, creaky chairs, and a radio my mother often played to listen to country music. She worked as a textile factory worker, leaving early and returning late, her hands rough from the threads but still soft when she stroked my hair. She used to tell me fairy tales, stories of knights and dragons which, looking back, I realized she told to make me forget the hungry days or my father's grumbling. My father, Kenneth Scott, was a used car salesman at a local dealership. He was tall with a booming voice, but his eyes were always full of irritation. He never hit me or my mother, but he had a way of hurting us with words as sharp as knives. "You're just a burden, Travis," he'd say whenever I accidentally spilled a glass of water or forgot to do my homework. To him, my mother and I seemed to be the reason for all his failures. From not getting a promotion to not having enough money to fix the roof. My mother always told me not to take it to heart, that he was just tired, but I could see the hurt in her eyes every time he yelled. Still, my childhood had its bright spots. My mother made simple mashed potato cakes, but to me they were the most delicious thing in the world. On the rare evenings when she didn't have to work the night shift, she'd sit next to me on the armchair talking about her dream of one day opening a small bakery where she could make bread for the whole town. I'd sit there hugging her arm, breathing in the faint smell of old fabric from her jacket, feeling like the entire world couldn't hurt me. Then that day came. I clearly remember that evening. The sky was gray with a light drizzle. My mother kissed my forehead before leaving for her night shift, saying, "Sleep well, my boy. Tomorrow I'll make potato cakes for you." I nodded, grinning widely, not knowing it would be the last time I saw her smile. The next morning, a stranger knocked on the door and told my father that my mother had been in an accident. My father just nodded, his face expressionless, and told me to go to my room. I didn't understand what was happening, but I obeyed, sitting in the corner of my room, clutching the shawl my mother used to drape over me. Then I overheard my father on the phone, his voice as flat as if he were discussing the weather. "Yes, I understand. I'll come to claim the body." My mother was gone and everything inside me shattered. I no longer saw the sunlight or heard her singing. I started having strange dreams where she stood in the factory, being pulled into a giant machine, but I couldn't run to save her. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, wanting to scream but unable to. My father never spoke of her after that. He went to work, came home, ate, and drank as if she had never existed. I, on the other hand, clung tightly to her memory, from the cheap perfume she wore to the way she folded my clothes. I was afraid that if I let go, she would disappear completely. Our house became cold. Dinners were no longer filled with laughter, only the dry clinking of spoons against plates like rain on a tin roof. My father barely spoke to me, and I didn't want to talk to him either. I started spending more time alone, sitting in my room, holding on to memories of my mother. I began to think the world was too unfair. My mother had worked so hard, never harmed anyone, yet she was the one who died. Meanwhile, my father, who never cared about her or me, was still alive, still breathing, still laughing with strangers at the car dealership. 2 years later, when I turned 14, my father announced he was getting remarried. I still remember the day he brought Sharon King home. She was tall, thin, with dyed blonde hair and lips always pursed as if hiding something. Sharon had 2 children of her own, one 10 and one 8, who looked at me like I was a stray dog. My father introduced her with an excited voice, as if she were the new light of his life. "Sharon will be your new mother. Treat her well," he said, but his eyes weren't on me. They were on Sharon, as if I were an unnecessary piece of furniture. Sharon wasn't cruel, but she wasn't my mother. She didn't hug me, didn't tell stories, didn't ask if I was hungry. She only cared about my father and her 2 children. My father changed completely. He smiled more, bought gifts for Sharon's kids, even renovated the house to suit her. And me? I was like I didn't exist. He started calling me kid instead of my name, and every time I did something wrong, even something as small as forgetting to wash the dishes, he'd yell, "Don't you see Sharon's tired? Don't bother her." I tried to endure, thinking my father just needed time. But then one day he called me into the living room where Sharon sat on the couch holding a cup of tea, her eyes glancing over me like I was a stranger. "Travis," he said in a flat voice, "you're going to live with your grandfather for a while. It'll be better for you there, and I need to focus on taking care of my new family." New family. Those words stabbed into my heart like a knife. I wanted to scream, to ask him why he was abandoning me, but I just nodded, knowing that no matter what I said, it would be pointless. A few days later, I was sent to my grandfather's house, Howard Scott, in a small town a few hours' drive from Fargo. I stood silently in the middle of a dilapidated wooden house, the sharp stench of alcohol assaulting my nose, as if the air itself was warning me of the days to come. The wooden walls were peeling, the floor creaked under every step, and empty bottles lay scattered everywhere like relics of an endless battle. I was only 14, but in that moment I knew I had just stepped into hell. My grandfather didn't greet me or ask if I was okay. He just looked at me with bloodshot eyes and growled, "Put your bag down, kid. No one's going to coddle you here." In that moment, I knew life here would be anything but easy. This house had no room for love. My grandfather, once a skilled carpenter, was now just a shadowy figure shrouded in cigarette smoke and liquor fumes. He was tall but gaunt, with disheveled white hair and trembling hands whenever he didn't have a glass of alcohol in them. In the early days, I naively thought that if I behaved, if I cleaned the house or cooked, he might treat me better. I was wrong. He didn't need a grandson. He needed someone to vent his anger on, a living punching bag to absorb all the frustrations of his life. On the first day, I tried cleaning the kitchen, picking up the scattered empty bottles and wiping the dust off the table. My grandfather walked in, looked at me and sneered, "Who do you think you are? Your grandmother?" Then he threw an empty whiskey bottle into the corner of the room, the sound of shattering glass ringing out like a warning. I bowed my head, my heart pounding, not daring to say a word. From then on, I learned to shrink myself, to tread lightly, to speak as little as possible, like a small animal trying to avoid the gaze of a predator. But there was no escaping my grandfather when he was drunk. On the nights he drank, the house turned into a stage of horrors. He'd sit in his old armchair, the crackling radio playing mournful country songs, and call me over. "Get over here, kid," he'd bellow, his voice hoarse from liquor. I knew what was coming. He'd shove a glass of alcohol into my hand, forcing me to drink. "Drink it, don't make me mad," he'd yell, and if I refused, he'd slap me, or worse, lash me with his belt until I collapsed on the floor. The first time I drank his liquor, I choked and coughed, the burning liquid scorching my throat, making me want to vomit. But he just laughed, a twisted smile as if my pain was his only source of joy. I began to dread the fall of night. I slept on a moldy mattress in the corner of the living room, but sleep was never restful. My grandfather shouting, cursing, or sometimes sobbing as he called out for my grandmother, a woman I'd never met, kept me awake. One time I woke up to find him standing over me, his bloodshot eyes staring down. "You're like your father," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Weak. Useless." Those words cut into my heart like knives, but I just lay still, pretending to sleep, praying he'd go away. Meals at my grandfather's house were a cruel joke. The table was always brimming with liquor, whiskey, bourbon, homemade moonshine, whatever he could get his hands on. But food was scarce. Some days I'd only get a dry slice of bread or a bowl of watery porridge. I grew gaunt, my eyes sunken, but my grandfather didn't care. "Want good food? Earn your own money," he'd say, then turn back to his bottle. The neighbors sometimes heard the sounds of me being beaten, the shattering of bottles, but no one intervened. They'd just shake their heads, whispering about poor Howard and that poor kid. But their pity didn't help. I was alone, completely alone, like an animal trapped in a cage. In that hell, I started finding ways to survive. Not by fighting back against my grandfather, I knew I wasn't strong enough, but by understanding the thing that was destroying me: alcohol. My grandfather had a stash of bottles in the house, from cheap swill to strange, unmarked liquors of unknown origin. Each time he forced me to drink, I began to pay attention to them. I smelled, tasted, and remembered. I noticed subtle differences. This bottle had the scent of charred oak. That one was bitter like gunpowder, another sweet like spoiled honey. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe because it was the only thing I could control. The only thing that made me feel I wasn't entirely powerless. I started sneaking bottles when my grandfather passed out drunk, not to drink, but to study. I'd sit in the corner of the room, under the dim light of an oil lamp, smelling each bottle, tasting small sips, and trying to understand them. Cheap whiskey stung like fire in my throat. Better bourbon was smoother with a sweet aftertaste. Homemade moonshine was harsh, but if I paid attention, I could detect a faint hint of barley. I wrote down my observations in an old notebook, the only thing I'd brought from my father's house. Those scribbled lines were my secret, a tiny flicker of light in the darkness. But don't misunderstand, I hated alcohol. I hated how it turned my grandfather into a monster. Hated the smell of liquor that clung to my fingers. Hated the burning sensation every time I was forced to drink. But I also knew that in this world I had nothing else to hold on to. My mother was gone. My father had abandoned me. And my grandfather saw me as a thorn in his side. My strange ability to discern the flavors of alcohol, however odd, was the only thing that made me feel I still had some worth, even if just a little. Some nights, when my grandfather was passed out drunk, I'd sit by the window looking out at the starry sky and think of my mother. I remembered her voice, the way she stroked my hair, the warm mashed potato cakes she made. I wondered what she'd think if she saw me now, a scrawny kid covered in bruises living among bottles and beatings. I told myself she'd want me to be strong, to find a way out. But how? I had no money, no place to go, no one to turn to. My grandfather's beatings grew worse. One time he was so drunk he threw a bottle at the wall, glass shards scattering across the floor, one grazing my arm and leaving a scar I still carry today. He made me kneel on the floor, cleaning up every piece while he sat there, drinking from another bottle. "You should be grateful for me," he roared. "Without me, you'd be dead on the streets." I didn't respond. I just bowed my head, cleaned the floor, and let my tears mix with the dirt. But deep inside, a fire began to burn. I didn't want to die in this house. I didn't want to become a man like my grandfather or my father, who discarded me without hesitation. I started dreaming of a day when I could leave, when I could stand tall without fear. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to survive. Every time I was forced to drink, every time I was beaten, I told myself, "You'll get through this. You have to get through this." 3 years passed, but to me it felt like a lifetime. I was 17, taller, thinner, my eyes now carrying invisible scars. I had learned to endure, to stay silent, to hide my pain. But I also learned something else. Alcohol wasn't just the thing destroying me. It was also the key to understanding this world. I didn't know that this strange ability born from those hellish nights would become the weapon to pull me out of the darkness. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here any longer. That night, as my grandfather lay passed out drunk, I stood up, looked around the liquor-soaked house one last time, and decided I was going to run away. That night began like any other. My grandfather sat in his armchair, clutching a bottle of whiskey, muttering incoherent curses. But this time, he was drunker than usual, and his anger flared like a wildfire. I accidentally spilled a glass of liquor while pouring it for him, and that was enough to set him off. "You did that on purpose, didn't you, you little bastard?" he roared, jumping to his feet, his belt gripped tightly in his hand. I tried to dodge, but I wasn't fast enough. The lashes came down relentlessly, my skin burning with each strike, and when he finally stopped, I collapsed onto the floor, blood trickling from the corner of my mouth. My grandfather stood there panting, then turned back to his bottle as if nothing had happened. I lay there on the cold wooden floor, listening to the rain beginning to fall outside. The pain wasn't from the bruises, I was used to those. The pain came from the realization that if I stayed, I would die. Not from the beatings, but from my soul being crushed day by day. I didn't want to become a shadow, didn't want to turn into my grandfather, or worse, into my father, the man who had abandoned me without a second thought. I stood up, staggering, and looked at my grandfather one last time. He had passed out, his mouth agape, the bottle slipping from his hand onto the floor. I quietly gathered my things. The old tattered backpack was all I had. I stuffed it with a few clothes, the notebook where I'd scribbled my observations about liquor, the pages filled with messy notes about the flavors of every bottle I'd tasted, and my mother's shawl, the last thing that still held her warmth. I had no money, no plan, only a fire burning in my chest. I had to get out. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold rain stinging my face. The wind howled through the trees as if urging me to run faster. I glanced back at the dilapidated wooden house one last time, the faint glow of the oil lamp flickering through the window. Then I started running, my bare feet splashing through the muddy ground, my breath mingling with the sound of the rain. I walked all night along dirt roads leading out of town. The rain gradually stopped, leaving behind a pitch-black sky with only a few stars peeking through, as if watching over me. I didn't know where I was going, but each step was a declaration. I wasn't going back. When dawn broke, I stopped at an old gas station, huddling on a stone bench, clutching my backpack for warmth. Hungry, cold, and scared, but I felt free. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to fear the sound of my grandfather's belt or the stench of liquor in my nose. I pulled out my mother's shawl, pressed it to my face, and breathed in the familiar scent of old fabric. "Mom," I whispered, "I'll make it. I promise." I hitched a ride on a truck heading to a small city a few dozen miles away. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick beard, looked at me with curiosity. "Kid, you look like you just escaped from hell," he said, handing me a stale piece of bread. I nodded, took a bite of the dry bread, and said nothing. I didn't want to tell my story, not out of shame, but because I wanted to leave it behind like I'd left my grandfather's house in the rain. The new city was an unfamiliar world. The streets were crowded, the blaring horns of cars mixed with the smell of exhaust and food wafting from roadside stalls. I wandered, my feet aching, my stomach gnawing with hunger. But I didn't dare stop. I knew if I stopped, fear would swallow me whole. I knocked on the doors of every shop, from grocery stores to auto repair garages, begging for work. Most shooed me away, a scrawny kid with messy hair and tattered clothes. "Get lost, kid. We don't feed beggars here," one shop owner barked, and I just bowed my head and walked away. In those early days, I slept wherever I could, park benches, alley corners, or abandoned warehouses. I ate what people threw away, half a sandwich, a bruised apple, sometimes a few leftover fries from a trash can. I was hungry, but I didn't complain. Every day I survived was a victory, a step further from my grandfather's house. I learned to endure the cold nights, to curl up in my mother's shawl to sleep, and to smile at strangers even though my heart felt empty. One day I stopped in front of a small diner with a sign that read Joe's Place. The smell of grilled meat and fries wafted out, making my stomach growl. Mustering all my courage, I pushed the door open and asked the man behind the counter if there was any work for me. The man, Joe, looked me up and down and asked, "Kid, what can you do?" I fumbled for words but managed to say, "I can wash dishes, clean tables, anything." Joe frowned but then nodded. "Give it a week. Don't let me down." The job at Joe's was grueling. I worked from early morning until midnight, my hands wrinkled from soaking in soapy water, my back aching from bending to scrub floors. Every day I washed hundreds of plates, wiped tables, and cleaned the kitchen. The pay was meager, but it was enough to rent a tiny room, a cramped space with just a foldable bed and a rickety wooden table. Every night I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking of my mother. I wondered if she'd be proud of me, a 17-year-old kid trying to survive in this harsh world. One evening, while wiping down tables, I overheard a group of customers ordering drinks. The server, a girl named Lucy, was struggling to differentiate between the types of whiskey they wanted. I was nearby, and for some reason I blurted out, "That's Jack Daniels, not Jim Beam." The charred oak smell is stronger, with a sweeter aftertaste. Lucy looked at me like I'd just performed magic, and Joe, who was behind the counter, turned around. "Kid, what do you know about liquor?" he asked, his tone half skeptical, half curious. Hesitantly, I explained how I'd learned to recognize the smell and taste of liquor during my years with my grandfather. I didn't mention the beatings or the nights I was forced to drink, just that I had learned. Joe let out a hearty laugh and handed me a glass of cheap whiskey. "Try it," he said. I took a sip, closed my eyes, and said, "This is watered down, low proof with a slight metallic tang, probably from an old barrel." Joe's eyes widened and he burst out laughing. "This kid's got talent." From then on, Joe moved me to the bar instead of just washing dishes. I learned to pour drinks, mix simple cocktails, and observe the customers. I realized that liquor wasn't just a drink, it told stories. A glass of bourbon evoked fields of barley under the sun. A cheap whiskey was like the weary sigh of exhausted workers. I wrote everything down in my old notebook. How customers drank, how they talked about liquor, and how a single drink could shift their mood. Customers started noticing me, not as just some kid, but because I could tell them the story behind each glass. But life wasn't always easy. Some nights, lying on my foldable bed, listening to the sound of traffic outside, I felt loneliness creep in. I missed my mother, the days when she was by my side. I wondered how my father was doing, if he ever thought of me, or if he'd completely forgotten the son he abandoned. In those moments, I'd pull out my mother's shawl, press it to my face, and let silent tears fall. But then I'd tell myself, "You can't be weak, Travis. You have to keep going." A big opportunity came one busy evening. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit walked into the diner. He ordered an expensive bottle of liquor, the kind Joe rarely sold because of its price. Lucy, the server, fumbled as she brought out the bottle, and I immediately knew something was off. The liquor was fake. I couldn't explain why I was so sure, but the smell was wrong. Too sweet, lacking the sharp, fiery note it should have had. I quietly told Joe, who checked and discovered the supplier had delivered subpar stock. The customer, who turned out to be a well-known liquor critic, was impressed when Joe apologized sincerely and replaced the bottle. He asked, "Who spotted the fake?" Joe pointed at me and the man smiled. "Kid, you've got a gift. Don't waste it." Those words were like a spark. Joe started trusting me more, letting me work the bar regularly, even allowing me to experiment with cocktails. I created one called Fargo Rain, a simple whiskey drink with a touch of lemon and honey inspired by the night I ran away. Customers loved it, and Joe clapped me on the shoulder, saying, "Kid, you were born for this." For the first time, I felt like I had worth, not just as a wandering kid. I officially became a bartender. I no longer slept in alleys or ate scraps, but deep down I still carried the pain of my past. My mother, my father, my grandfather, and the invisible scars. Every night as I closed up the bar, I'd sit alone, sip a glass of whiskey, and think about the road ahead. I knew I hadn't reached my destination, but I had found a path. I was Travis Scott, and I wouldn't let my past define me. Standing behind the bar at Joe's place, I began to feel the pulse of a new life. The bar was my world, bottles of liquor glimmering under the golden lights, the clink of glasses and the stories of customers blending with the scent of oak and honey. I didn't just pour drinks, I told stories. Every glass of whiskey, every cocktail carried a memory and emotion. Joe noticed that I wasn't just skilled at mixing drinks, but also had a knack for making customers come back. "Travis, you've got a gift for making people feel special," he said, patting my shoulder with a rare smile. After just a few months, he made me head bartender, a huge leap for a kid who wasn't even old enough to drink legally. I started managing the bar, creating new menus, and training the other staff. Lucy, the waitress who used to fumble with whiskey bottles, now looked at me with a mix of admiration and envy. "You've brought this bar to life," she said. And I just smiled, but deep down I knew I was building something bigger. The crowd at Joe's place grew steadily. It wasn't just the usual working-class folks anymore. Liquor traders, critics, and the city's elite started to take notice. They called me the kid who knows his booze, not with mockery but with curiosity. Once, a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as a drinks journalist asked me to make him a cocktail, any cocktail, but it had to have soul. I mixed a bourbon with a hint of cinnamon and charred orange, telling him the story of a cold winter in Fargo when I dreamed of a warm home. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and nodded. "You're not just selling drinks, you're selling memories," he said, then wrote a small article about me. That article, though only published in a local paper, changed everything. Joe's place became a hotspot, and I, once a dishwashing kid, was now the center of conversations. But I didn't stop there. I knew that if I remained just a bartender, I'd be confined to this bar forever. I started dreaming bigger, a bar of my own where I could tell my stories through every glass, where I could stand tall and say, "This is Travis Scott's world." I spent nights reading books about liquor, from the history of whiskey to brewing techniques. I borrowed books from the library, took detailed notes, and even sneaked into liquor trade shows to learn. I wanted to understand not just how to mix drinks, but how to create them, from barley to barrel, from yeast to the final drop. At 19, I had saved a small sum from my grueling days at Joe's place, every penny from dishwashing, bartending, and the rare tips from customers. With that money, I decided to bet on my dream, opening my own bar. I found a rundown corner on Jefferson Street, just a few blocks from Joe's place in the heart of the city. It was a shabby street with long-shuttered shops and rusted signs, but I saw potential there. A spot close enough to draw Joe's regulars, but far enough for me to make my own mark. I named the bar Scarf, a nod to my mother, evoking the scarf I still kept as a talisman. The bar was small, with just enough room for 4 wooden tables I built myself from cheap planks bought at a flea market, and a simple bar counter I crafted from recycled wood. Everything was rough around the edges, but it was mine, the first piece of land where I planted my flag. I hung a painting of my mother on the wall behind the bar, not for the customers to see, but to remind myself why I was here. For her, for the days she held me and promised everything would be okay. I wiped that painting every day like a ritual to keep her smile shining. When I told Joe about my plan to open the bar, I worried he'd object. After all, Scarf was close to Joe's place, and I feared he'd think I was competing. But Joe, with his salt and pepper hair and kind smile, just patted my shoulder. "Kid, you've got guts," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I'm not promising to drink there every day, but I'll support you. Do it well, and don't forget to pour me a glass on opening day." I smiled, relieved, and felt a deeper gratitude for Joe than ever. He didn't just give me my first job. He was the first to believe I could do something greater. Joe didn't stop at words. While I was fixing up the bar, he sent over a crate of craft beer and a set of old glassware from Joe's place, saying, "These suit your style better." He also introduced me to a few reliable liquor suppliers, helping me secure quality whiskey bottles at reasonable prices. "But be careful, kid," he winked. "Don't let those suppliers scam you like they did me." Joe's support, however small, was a massive motivator as I started out. On the opening day of Scarf, a light rain fell, reminding me of the night I ran away from my grandfather's house. Only a few regulars from Joe's place came to support: Lucy, the waitress once amazed by my knack for liquor, and a handful of frequent customers who enjoyed my stories. Joe showed up too, as promised, sitting at the bar with a half smile. "This place has soul, Travis," he said, raising a glass of Fargo Rain. I mixed for him. "But you need more lights, it's too damn dark." I laughed, feeling my heart lighten. Though the bar was quiet and only a few drinks were sold, I wasn't discouraged. I stood behind the counter, pouring drinks with all my passion, telling stories about Fargo's rain, lonely nights, and dreams that never die. Gradually, Scarf became a place people sought out not just to drink, but to feel. I didn't just mix cocktails, I crafted experiences. A gin with rosemary and lemon spoke of the first summer I felt free. A rich bourbon told of the scars I carried from my grandfather. Customers loved those stories, and they shared them with friends. Before long, the bar started to fill up. Men in suits, women in sparkling jewelry, and even liquor critics began to show up. Once, a wealthy patron, after sipping my Fargo Rain, left a tip double the bill and said, "You should expand this place. You've got a rare talent." But expanding wasn't easy. I needed capital, and my savings were only enough to keep the bar running. I started learning about brewing, taking short courses, and even took a risk by borrowing a small loan to buy artisanal brewing equipment. I wanted to create something truly my own, not just mix drinks, but produce liquor that bore the Travis Scott mark. In the long nights at my rented room, I studied how to select barley, choose oak barrels, and control yeast. I failed many times. The first batches were either too bitter or lacked any memorable flavor. But each failure reminded me of my mother, of how she never gave up despite life's harshness. I pressed on. Then Benjamin Shaw appeared. He was an investor, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, sharp yet warm eyes. He came to Scarf one evening, ordered a simple whiskey, and watched me all night. As the bar was about to close, he called me over. "You've got fire in you, Travis," he said in a low voice. "Not everyone can turn pain into art like you." I was flustered, unsure how to respond, but he continued, "I want to invest in you. Not just this bar, but your dream of brewing." I was stunned. Benjamin didn't just bring money, he brought belief. He helped me set up a small brewing workshop on the outskirts of town, provided equipment, and connected me with the best suppliers. More importantly, he taught me to see beyond the present, to turn a small bar into a brand. "You're not just selling liquor, Travis," he said. "You're selling your story, and this world is always thirsty for good stories." With Benjamin's support, my workshop began producing the first batches of whiskey named Scarf. Each bottle was a piece of memory, from the smoky oak evoking cold Fargo nights to the subtle sweetness reminiscent of my mother's stories. Customers loved them, and soon Scarf was no longer just a bar but a small brand, mentioned in liquor magazines and at trade shows. Yet even with success, the shadows of my past wouldn't let go. Some nights after the bar closed, I sat alone, sipping whiskey, and saw my mother's image, her gentle smile, her hoarse singing voice. I remembered my father who abandoned me and my grandfather who turned my childhood into hell. Those invisible scars still ached, no matter how far I'd come. I wondered if I'd ever truly escape them or if they'd always be part of me. Benjamin sensed my turmoil. One day, as we sat in the brewing workshop, he said, "Travis, you don't need to forget your past. Let it fuel your fire." His words made me think. I began weaving my story into every bottle, every cocktail. Each drop of liquor was a piece of me, pain, hope, and the drive to rise. Customers felt it, and they kept coming back, not just for good drinks, but because they saw a piece of themselves in those glasses. At 25, I had a bustling bar, a small but promising brewing workshop, and the respect of those who once saw me as a wandering kid. Benjamin became a mentor, a friend, and almost a second father. But I knew my journey wasn't over. I still carried a void, not from a lack of success, but from unanswered questions. What would my mother think of me now? Did my father ever regret leaving? And could I ever forgive those who hurt me? I stood in the workshop looking at the neatly stacked oak barrels, the scent of barley and fermenting yeast blending into the air like a low melody. I knew I had found my path, but that path still stretched far ahead. Over the next 4 years, by the time I was 29, I looked back and saw a journey I couldn't have imagined even in my wildest dreams. From a homeless kid sleeping in alleys and eating leftover bread, I was now the owner of a chain of bars named Scarf, spanning 3 major cities, along with a renowned distillery where my whiskeys were sought after by connoisseurs. The press dubbed me the Liquor Tycoon, a glamorous title, but to me it was just the outer shell of a journey filled with blood and tears. My distillery was no longer the small suburban workshop. It had grown into a complex with oak barrels imported from Kentucky, state-of-the-art distillation systems, and a team of employees I treated like family. Customers didn't just drink my liquor, they drank my story, and that made Scarf not only famous but beloved. Liquor critics wrote about me, business magazines invited me for interviews, and the elite lined up to reserve tables at my bars. Of all the factors that brought me this far, I owed the most to Benjamin Shaw. He wasn't just an investor, he was a guide, someone who saw the fire in me when I could only see darkness. Nearing 60, Benjamin still carried a rugged charm, with his salt and pepper hair and a subtle half-smile. He often visited my main bar, sitting in a corner of the counter, ordering a glass of Scarf whiskey and watching me work. "You remind me of myself when I was young," he once said, "but you're stronger than I ever was." I wasn't sure I was as strong as he thought, but I was grateful he believed in me. One day, Benjamin invited me to his home, a luxurious mansion in the suburbs, a place I never thought I'd set foot in. When I arrived, I met Teresa, his daughter. She was 26 with long brown hair, eyes that seemed to speak, and a smile that left me flustered. Teresa wasn't like the high society women I'd met. She wasn't haughty or cold. She asked me about whiskey, about how I created Fargo Rain, and listened as if my story was the most important thing in the world. I spoke hesitantly, but she smiled and said, "You tell stories even better than you mix drinks." For the first time in years, my heart raced, not from fear, but from a strange, warm feeling. Teresa and I started seeing each other more often. She came to the bar, sat at the counter, and we talked about everything. From liquor to dreams, from rainy days in Fargo to sunny mornings in California, where she'd gone to college. She knew about my past, not from me, but from her father, who had shared the story of the kid who knew his booze with pride. Teresa never looked at me with pity. Instead, she comforted me by listening, by holding my hand when I spoke about my mother. A year later, Benjamin called me to his office. I thought he wanted to discuss opening another bar, but he just smiled and said, "Travis, I want you to become part of my family." I was stunned, not understanding what he meant, until he continued, "Teresa loves you, and I see how you treat her." I couldn't ask for anyone more deserving. I sat there, hands trembling, unable to believe my ears. Benjamin Shaw, the man who had turned my dreams into reality, now wanted me to marry his daughter. Our wedding took place on a spring day in a flower-filled garden at Benjamin's mansion. The press called it the wedding of the year. Grand, dazzling, with hundreds of guests, from business tycoons to liquor critics. Teresa walked in wearing a white dress, beautiful as a dream, and I, in a tailored black suit for the first time in my life, felt like I was living in a world that didn't belong to me. When she took my hand at the altar, I looked into her eyes and saw a future I'd never dared to dream of. But as we exchanged vows, I felt a small void in my heart, not because I didn't love Teresa, but because my mother wasn't there to witness it. The press wrote about me like a fairy tale, from a slum kid to North Dakota's liquor tycoon. They photographed me standing in front of the distillery, holding a bottle of Scarf, smiling confidently. They recounted my journey, from wandering the streets to packed bars, from failed batches of liquor to sought-after whiskeys. But no one knew that. Every night when the bar's lights went out, I sat alone, sipped whiskey, and faced the shadows of my past. Teresa understood. She didn't try to erase my past. Instead, she helped me carry it more lightly. One night, as I sat in the small office of the distillery, Teresa walked in and placed her hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to forget your mother," she said, her voice soft as a breeze. "She's the reason you're as strong as you are today. Let her be proud." I looked at her, tears welling up, and for the first time I told her everything. About the nights my grandfather beat me, about the day my father pushed me out of the house, about how I once thought I wasn't worth living. Teresa didn't say anything. She just held me, and in her arms my scars hurt a little less. My success wasn't just about money or fame. It was about how I turned pain into strength, how I transformed hellish nights into bottles of liquor that told stories. But I knew that no matter how much money or praise I received, true happiness was something I hadn't yet reached. Some nights, as Teresa slept beside me, I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking of my mother, wondering if she could see me now. A successful man, but still carrying the heart of a 12-year-old boy, waiting for her to come home from a night shift. I started keeping a journal, not to record notes about liquor, but to capture my emotions. I wrote about my mother, about the days I thought I wouldn't survive. I wrote about Teresa, about how she made me believe I was worthy of love. And I wrote about the future, a future I hoped would be more than just bottles and bars, but a true home where I could heal old wounds. Then, on a winter morning, I received news that my grandfather had passed away. I was in the distillery inspecting a new batch of whiskey when my phone rang. A cold, unfamiliar voice spoke. "Howard Scott died last night. I'm a social worker contacting you based on the last address he provided." I stood frozen, still holding the sample bottle, but my mind was yanked back to the crumbling wooden house in that small town 12 years ago. The sharp smell of alcohol, the crack of a belt against skin, and my grandfather's bloodshot eyes all came rushing back, vivid as if I'd never left. I didn't cry, not because I was heartless, but because I didn't know what to feel. My grandfather, the man who had ruined my childhood, who turned 3 years of my life into hell, was gone. But instead of relief, I felt only a heavy void in my chest. I sat down, placed the bottle on the table, and stared out the window. Snow fell silently, blanketing the oak barrels in the distillery yard. I thought about my grandfather. Not the drunken, lonely old man in a house littered with empty bottles, but the man he might have been. A skilled carpenter who once crafted sturdy tables and chairs imbued with the warmth of wood. I wondered what had turned him into the monster I knew. Was it the alcohol? The pain of losing my grandmother? Or was he simply not strong enough to face life? Whatever it was, he left me with scars that would never heal, but also unintentionally gave me a vital skill. The ability to understand liquor, which brought me to where I am today. Teresa found me still sitting there, eyes fixed on the snowflakes outside. "Travis, what's wrong?" she asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. I told her about the call, about my grandfather's death, and about the tangled emotions choking me. I didn't know what to do. Should I attend the funeral or let him go without a final glance? Teresa listened without interrupting, her eyes gentle yet resolute. "You don't have to forgive him," she said, "but you can choose to close that chapter of your past in your own way. Hold a proper funeral, not because he deserves it, but because you want to prove you're different from him. For you, and for your mother." Her words made me think. I remembered my mother, how she always chose kindness despite life's cruelty. She wouldn't want me to hold on to resentment no matter how unforgivable my grandfather's actions were. I decided to return to the small town I had fled 12 years earlier. Teresa came with me, holding my hand through the long drive. When the car stopped in front of the old wooden house, I barely recognized it. The walls were more dilapidated, the tin roof rusted, and the front yard overgrown with weeds. I stepped inside, still catching a faint whiff of alcohol in the air, though the house was now cold and empty. On the table, I found an old photo. My grandfather and grandmother, young, smiling, holding a wooden chair. It was the first time I'd seen him smile, even if only in a picture. I slipped the photo into my pocket, unsure why, but feeling I needed to keep it. I contacted the local funeral home, requesting a dignified funeral for my grandfather. They were surprised. No one in town thought Howard Scott, the lonely drunk, would be sent off properly. But I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for my mother, for Teresa, and for myself. I paid for everything: an oak coffin, white flowers covering it, and a ceremony at the town's small church. I even hired a band to play the country tunes he used to blast on his crackling radio. On the day of the funeral, I stood in front of the church, dressed in a black suit, hands in my pockets, watching the attendees arrive. Old neighbors who had once heard my cries but never intervened now greeted me awkwardly, heads bowed. A few of my grandfather's acquaintances, other weathered drunks, came with haggard faces, whispering thanks. I didn't say much, just nodded. Teresa stood beside me, holding my hand, her presence the only thing keeping me steady. As the priest read the prayers, I looked at the coffin and thought of the nights my grandfather forced me to drink, the punches, the insults. But I also thought of how I learned the taste of whiskey, how I turned pain into fire. He had broken me, but unintentionally, he'd also given me a weapon. When I returned to the city, I received a flood of messages from customers, partners, and even the press. They praised my decency, the way I honored someone who had hurt me. One newspaper wrote, "Travis Scott is not just a liquor tycoon, but a symbol of forgiveness." I read it and gave a wry smile. Forgiveness? I wasn't sure that was the right word. I didn't hold the funeral out of kindness. I did it to close a chapter of my life. Teresa understood. That evening, as we sat in the distillery office, she poured 2 glasses of Scarf whiskey and raised hers. "To you," she said, "the man who turned pain into strength." I looked into her eyes, seeing my mother's light in them, and for the first time in years, I felt relief. Not because my grandfather was gone, but because I had chosen to face him, not with hatred, but with dignity. The funeral, with its oak coffin and white flowers, was my way of closing a painful chapter. I thought I was ready to move forward, carrying my mother's scarf and Teresa's love, to build a future unshadowed by the past. But I was wrong. The past never truly lets go, and it returned, not through memories, but through a person I thought I'd forgotten, my father. That day, I had just returned home after a long day at the distillery, carrying a mix of relief and emptiness. Snow was still falling outside, blanketing the road leading to the house Teresa and I shared, while the scent of burning wood from the living room fireplace wafted out like a quiet comfort. Teresa was staying at Benjamin's mansion to prepare for a charity event, so I was alone in the small room I called my private corner, where I kept my prized scarf bottles and my journal. I sat at the wooden table, poured a glass of whiskey, feeling the bittersweet taste spread across my tongue, and opened my journal. But as I reached for my pen, the doorbell rang, a sharp, cold sound cutting through the quiet night. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. No one came to my house at this hour, especially on a snowy night like this. I stood up, walked through the living room, the firelight casting shadows on the walls, creating a false sense of warmth. When I opened the door, I froze. Standing before me was my father, Kenneth Scott, the man who had abandoned me 15 years ago. He had aged significantly, his hair streaked with gray, his face gaunt, his eyes flickering with a strange light, half remorse, half calculation. He wore a black suit, but it was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his tie askew. Beside him was Sharon, my stepmother, still tall and thin, her dyed blonde hair unchanged, but her face as cold as the day I left their house. She stood there tapping on her phone, not bothering to look at me. "Travis," my father spoke, his voice thick and trembling as if holding back tears. How are you?" I didn't answer immediately, just stood there, my gaze cold, my hand still gripping the doorknob. A flood of memories rushed back. The day he called me a burden. The day he sent me to live with my grandfather. The day he turned his back on me to build his new family. I wanted to scream, to demand why he dared show up after all these years, but I only nodded, my voice flat. "Come in." I led them to my study where the golden lamplight illuminated the bottles of liquor on the shelves. My father sat down, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket while Sharon leaned against the wall, her eyes glued to her phone as if this meeting was just a chore she was forced to attend. I didn't offer them anything to drink, not out of stinginess, but because I didn't want to share any part of the world I had built with them. My father cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice dramatic. "Travis, I know I've done wrong by you. I've made many mistakes. When your mother died, I was in so much pain. I was pressured, had to remarry, had to take care of a new family." The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he hadn't changed. His words sounded like a rehearsed speech, but the longer he talked, the more his insincerity showed. He spoke of his struggles, his failing business, financial pressures, and how Sharon helped him through it. But not once did he offer a genuine apology. Not once did he acknowledge abandoning me, choosing Sharon and her 2 children over me. I sat there, my gaze cold, letting him speak, but inside painful memories flared like a fire. I remembered the day he told me to go live with my grandfather, his indifferent eyes as I walked out with my backpack, the way he never looked back. Then his tone shifted, becoming eager, almost fawning. "You're so successful now, Travis. I read the papers, saw them call you the liquor tycoon. I'm so proud." He smiled, but that smile sent a shiver down my spine. I knew where this was going. "But you know, things are tough for me now. Business isn't what it used to be, and Sharon needs money for the kids. Can you help me out a bit?" "Not much, just enough to get back on my feet." He paused, looking at me with expectant eyes, but he wasn't done. "And you know, if I could appear beside you at some of your events, people would respect me more. You're so famous now. If I'm seen with you, things would be easier." I nearly laughed, a bitter, choked laugh, not from amusement, but from the sheer gall. My father didn't just want money. He wanted to latch onto my fame, to use me as a ticket to reclaim his lost status. Sharon, still standing there, finally looked up from her phone, shooting my father an irritated glance. She seemed like someone dragged into a play she didn't want to perform. The awkward silence, coupled with her efforts to avoid my gaze, only confirmed what I'd long known. This meeting was my father's one-man show. I stood up, my footsteps echoing in the room, heavy with the scent of oak and fermenting yeast. On the shelf, the bottles gleamed like silent witnesses. I reached for a bottle of Scarf, the whiskey I'd made to honor my mother. I poured a glass, but not for my father, for myself. The bittersweet liquor spread across my tongue, leaving a stinging aftertaste in my throat. I set the glass down, looked straight into his eyes, and spoke, my voice calm but cold as steel. "Do you remember the day you sent me to live with Grandpa? You said it was for my own good, but the truth is you just didn't want to see me anymore." He opened his mouth, trying to justify himself, but I raised a hand, my gaze sharp as a blade. "Don't!" I've heard enough. I took a deep breath, trying to keep the fire in my chest from erupting into a storm. 3 years of hell. 3 years of beatings, of having liquor forced down my throat until I gagged, of being cursed at like I was worthless. Did you know? Number. You never asked. Not one phone call. Not one letter. You discarded me like a broken toy. I paused, my hand still gripping the glass, the sharp scent of whiskey mingling with the burning anger in my chest. When I spoke again, my voice was no longer trembling but firm, dry as a verdict. Now you come here not to apologize, but to ask for money, for fame. Do you think I owe you that? My father lowered his head, but I saw his shoulders tremble, not from remorse, but from the shame of being exposed. Sharon finally spoke, her voice cold. Travis, don't make this hard for your father. He's trying. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt pity. She didn't love my father, didn't love me, didn't love anyone but herself. She was here only because he'd forced her to come, and she wanted to leave as soon as possible. The air was heavy, as if this house, built by Teresa and me with love and effort, was rejecting their presence. I didn't want to prolong this meeting, but a part of me, the 14-year-old boy who was cast out by his father, still craved an answer. Not an apology, not remorse, but an acknowledgement, an admission that he was wrong, that I had paid the price for his selfishness. I took a deep breath, set the whiskey glass on the table, and looked straight at my father. You want my help, I said, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. But do you know how I lived after you abandoned me? He looked up, his eyes avoiding mine. My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sharon, still leaning against the doorframe, glanced at her watch, clearly eager to leave. I didn't care about her. I just looked at my father, waiting, hoping for a moment of sincerity. But he only mumbled, I didn't know things were that bad. I just wanted you to have a better life. His words sounded like a cheap excuse, and I knew he was lying. Not just to me, but to himself. I turned to the wooden shelf where I kept my special bottles. I pulled out an old whiskey, not Scarf, but a cheap brand, the kind my grandfather forced me to drink during those hellish nights. I placed it on the table along with 5 glass tumblers. You want my forgiveness, my help, I said, my voice steady. Then drink these. I filled all 5 glasses, each one representing the years I endured. 3 years with my grandfather and 2 years wandering before I found my path. My father stared at the glasses, his face paling. Travis, are you joking? He asked, his voice trembling. I can't drink that much. Sharon finally looked up, her tone icy. Travis, enough. Don't turn this into a game. I met her gaze, unflinching. This isn't a game, Sharon. This is justice. She fell silent, returning to her phone as if wanting no further part in this. My father picked up a glass, his hand shaking, took a small sip and coughed violently. He set it down, grimacing. Son, I can't. This stuff is awful. I nodded, unsurprised. I drank it every day when I was 14. You managed 1 sip. That's something. I stood, opened the front door, and gestured for them to leave. I don't owe you anything, I said. I built everything from nothing, without you, without anyone. If you need money, I can give you some. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to be like you, someone who turns their back on family. My father stood, his face ashen, his eyes filled with shame. He said nothing more, just walked out silently. Sharon trailing behind, still tapping on her phone, not once looking back. The door closed, and the sound of falling snow outside became the only noise in the quiet house. I returned to my private corner, sat down, my hands trembling. I took a sip of whiskey, tasting the bittersweet essence of my mother, gentle yet strong. Teresa came home that evening, finding me sitting alone by the fireplace. She didn't ask anything, just sat beside me, took my hand, and let me rest my head on her shoulder. Are you okay? She asked softly. I nodded but said nothing. Deep down I knew I was okay. Not because my father was gone, but because I had chosen to face him not with hatred but with dignity. just as I had with my grandfather. Teresa held me tighter, and in her embrace I felt a piece of my old scars heal, if only a little. The next morning I returned to the distillery where the oak barrels stood silently, aging new batches of whiskey. I opened a bottle of Scarf, poured a glass, and raised it as if toasting my mother. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I stood up and I won't fall again." I took a sip, tasting the memories of rainy nights in Fargo, of my grandfather's beatings, of the day my father abandoned me, and of the years I fought to become the Travis Scott I am today. I went home at noon. Teresa was in the kitchen preparing lunch, the smell of toasted bread and coffee lingering in the air. She looked up, smiled, and I knew she sensed my unusual mood. "You okay, Travis?" she asked, setting down her knife and walking over to me. I didn't answer right away, just pulled her into my arms, feeling her warmth like a balm for my invisible scars. "I'm okay," I said, "and I think I'm starting to understand what happiness is." We sat at the dining table and I told Teresa about the encounter with my father. I described the glasses of whiskey I set before him, how he couldn't bring himself to drink, and how I realized I didn't need his forgiveness to keep living. Teresa listened, as she always did, her eyes lighting up when I spoke of my mother. "You know," she said, "your mother didn't just give you the scarf. She gave you the strength to turn pain into art. Every bottle you make is a part of her." That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd put off for too long. I took my mother's scarf from the drawer, ran my fingers over the worn fabric, and brought it to the distillery. In a corner of the workshop, I set up a small shelf, placing the scarf there alongside a photo of my mother. The photo had faded, but her smile still shone like morning sunlight. I wrote a small inscription on the wooden plaque below. "Deborah Scott, the woman who gave me everything." As time passed, Teresa and I began thinking about starting a family. One night, as we lay in bed, she rested her head on my chest and said, "If we have kids, I want them to know about their grandmother, the woman who made you who you are." I held her hand, my heart warming. I imagined a day when I'd tell my children about my mother, about the scarf, about the whiskeys that bore her name. I wanted them to know that no matter how harsh life could be, they could always find light, as I had. Liquor was once the shackle that bound me, the tool my grandfather used to destroy me, the thing my father couldn't face. But it was also the wings that let me soar, carrying me from cold alleys to dazzling bars, from rainy Fargo nights to sunny days in the distillery. I didn't forgive my father to save him, but to free myself. I stood there in the distillery, looking at the oak barrels and breathing in the faint scent of yeast, knowing I had healed. Not completely, but enough to live a full life. I am Travis Scott, not just a liquor tycoon, not just a survivor, but a man who found light in the darkness and will keep bringing that light to others. 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 Light to others.